The sun was falling behind the tall red rocks, and two cowboys, Ethan and his younger brother Jesse, were riding home after a long week of work. Their horses were tired, and the road was quiet except for the sound of hooves on dry ground. Evening air felt heavy with dust, and both men were thinking of the warm meal waiting back at their small ranch. But suddenly Ethan stopped his horse, lifted his head and listened carefully. It was a faint sound, soft and broken, carried by the wind. Jesse looked around. "What is it, brother?" he asked. Ethan raised his hand for silence. After a few seconds, the sound came again, a weak cry, like someone calling for help. Without another word, Ethan turned his horse and rode toward the sound. Jesse followed closely, worried, but trusting his brother's instincts. The path took them down into a narrow canyon where the shadows were long and the air was cool. As they rode deeper, the cry grew clearer. It was a woman's voice. When they reached a small, dry creek bed, Ethan jumped off his horse. There, lying near a fallen tree, was a young Apache woman. Her leg was trapped under two heavy rocks, and her face was pale with pain and dust. She looked up at the two cowboys with fear in her eyes. Ethan moved slowly, holding his hands out to show he meant no harm. "Easy now," he said gently. "We're here to help you." She tried to pull away, whispering something in her own language, but she was too weak. Jesse came closer, speaking softly too. "It's all right. We'll get you free." Ethan knelt down beside her and studied the rocks. One was wedged tightly against her ankle. He used his small knife to dig around it, then pressed with his shoulder until it rolled aside. The woman gasped in pain as her leg came free, but she didn't cry out. Ethan tore a strip from his shirt and wrapped her ankle carefully. When he looked at her again, she was staring at him, breathing hard. "Name's Ethan," he said, trying to smile. "This here's Jesse. What's your name?" She hesitated, then spoke in soft, broken English. "Nita," she said. "That's a pretty name," Jesse said kindly. "You're safe now, Nita?" They lifted her gently and carried her to a shaded spot under some trees. Ethan gave her a sip of water, and she drank slowly as if afraid it would disappear. Jesse gathered dry sticks and started a small fire. The light from the flames touched Nita's face, and for the first time they saw how young she was, maybe 20, with long dark hair and eyes that had seen too much sorrow. As she rested, she began to speak in small, quiet sentences. Her words were broken but clear enough to understand. She told them she had been separated from her people after soldiers had driven their camp away. She had walked for days, hurt and alone, trying to find her way home. Her food was gone, her water was gone, and she had nearly given up when her foot got trapped between the rocks. Ethan listened without interrupting. He could see she was proud and strong, even in pain. "You're safe now," he said again, his voice steady. "We'll get you back to your people." She looked at him for a long moment before nodding slightly. The night air grew cool. The stars came out bright and sharp above the canyon. Jesse fell asleep beside the fire, but Ethan stayed awake, his eyes on the sky. He couldn't stop thinking about Nita, the courage in her eyes, the quiet way she fought through pain. She reminded him of the land itself, beautiful, harsh, and full of hidden strength. When the first light of dawn touched the hills, Ethan heard something new, the faint rumble of horses in the distance. He sat up quickly and woke Jesse. "You hear that?" he whispered. Jesse rubbed his eyes and listened. "Yeah, more than one horse, maybe 5 or 6. Nita's eyes opened. She looked toward the sound and whispered, frightened, "Men, bad men, they look for me." Ethan didn't ask who they were. He saw the fear on her face and knew enough. "We're leaving," he said firmly. Jesse packed their things fast while Ethan helped Nita onto his horse. She bit her lip as pain shot through her ankle, but she said nothing. They rode out of the canyon just as the first sun rays turned the rocks gold. The hoofbeats behind them grew louder, echoing through the dry air. Jesse looked over his shoulder. "They're coming fast." Ethan steered his horse toward the rocky hills. "We'll lose them in the pass." The trail was rough, full of sharp turns, but the brothers knew how to ride. Dust rose behind them as they climbed higher. When they reached a narrow path between two cliffs, Ethan spotted a small cave hidden behind some brush. "In there," he said. They pulled the horses inside just as a group of riders thundered past. The noise of hooves and shouting filled the canyon, then slowly faded into silence. Inside the cave, it was dark and cool. Nita sat quietly, clutching the edge of Ethan's coat. Her hands were trembling. "You're safe now," Ethan whispered. "They're gone." Tears welled in her eyes. "Why you help me?" she asked softly. "You don't know me." Ethan met her gaze. "'Cause it's the right thing to do," he said. "No one should be left out here to die." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Jesse smiled faintly and said, "Well, brother, looks like you found yourself a reason to be a hero again." Ethan just smiled back. "Maybe," he said quietly. They waited in the cave until the sun dropped lower in the sky. When they finally came out, the desert stretched calm and endless before them. Nita leaned on Ethan's arm as they walked to the horses. She looked weak, but her spirit was strong. The ride back to the ranch was slow. "What?" Ethan kept glancing back to make sure she was all right. At one point, she looked up and said softly, "You good, man?" He smiled, just doing what's right. When they finally reached the small wooden cabin that served as their home, the sky was full of stars again. Jesse opened the door, and warm light spilled out. Ethan carried Nita inside and helped her sit by the fire. She looked around the simple room, the handmade table, the old rocking chair, the shelves filled with tools and books. It wasn't fancy, but it felt safe. "You can rest here," Ethan said. "No one will find you." Nita nodded, her eyes soft. "Thank you," she whispered. As she fell asleep, Jesse leaned against the doorway and looked at his brother. "You think this is over?" he asked quietly. Ethan shook his head. "No, but for now, she's safe. It's all that matters." The two brothers sat in silence for a while, listening to the soft crackle of the fire. Outside, the wind moved through the sagebrush like a whisper. Ethan looked at Nita sleeping peacefully and felt something deep inside him change. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure, the moment he found her in that canyon. His life had taken a turn he could never forget. The desert outside was wide and silent, but in that little cabin, a new story had begun. It was the story of courage, kindness, and something that might one day become love. The morning light slowly filled the small wooden cabin. Ethan was already awake, sitting by the fire and boiling water for coffee. Nita slept peacefully on the bed they had made for her near the fireplace. Her injured ankle was wrapped tightly and her breathing was calm. Jesse came in from outside, his boots covered in dust, smiled when he saw Ethan watching her. "She's still asleep," Jesse whispered. Ethan nodded. "She needs it. She's been through a lot." After a few minutes, the smell of coffee filled the air. When Nita opened her eyes, she looked confused for a moment, not remembering where she was. Then she saw Ethan's calm face and relaxed. "Good morning," he said softly. She smiled a little. "Good morning," she replied in her quiet voice. Ethan handed her a cup of warm water. "Drink this first. Then we'll get you some breakfast." She took it carefully, her fingers brushing against his for a moment. That small touch made something warm move in Ethan's chest, but he said nothing. Jesse cooked a few biscuits on the iron pan and handed her one with honey. Nita ate slowly, saying thank you in her gentle accent. As the days passed, she started to get stronger. Every morning, Ethan helped her walk outside so she could feel the sun on her face. The desert looked endless, but in the distance, there were hills and small green patches where cacti bloomed. Nita loved watching them. "Your land is big," she said once. "So much sky." Ethan smiled. "Yes, it's a good place if you know how to live with it." At first, she spoke very little, but with time, she began to share small stories from her life. She told him about her people, how they moved with the seasons, how her mother used to braid her hair by the river. Ethan listened quietly, never interrupting. He was careful not to ask about the bad parts. He could see those memories still hurt her one evening. As the sun went down behind the hills, Ethan sat on the porch cleaning his old saddle. Nita came and stood beside him, leaning on the wooden post for balance. Her hair was tied back with a strip of cloth, and her eyes glowed in the fading light. "You work too much," she said softly. Ethan chuckled. "It's the only way to keep things going out here." Jesse came out with a grin. "He's been working too much all his life," he teased. Nita smiled at that, a small but real smile. It was the first time Ethan had seen her laugh, even a little. The sound made him forget the hard years and the loneliness that usually followed him. Days turned into weeks. Nita could walk better now, though she still limped slightly. She began helping around the ranch in small ways, feeding the chickens, sweeping the porch, washing clothes near the well. She did it quietly, always trying to be useful. Ethan told her she didn't have to, but she smiled and said, "Work makes the heart calm." Sometimes Jesse would go into town for supplies, leaving Ethan and Nita alone. Those evenings were quiet and peaceful. She would sit by the fire, weaving small patterns from dry grass, and Ethan would tell stories about life on the trail. One night, as the fire burned low, he told her about how he and Jesse lost their parents when they were young, and how the ranch was all they had left. Nita listened, her eyes soft. "You strong man," she said. "You protect what is yours." Ethan looked at her for a moment and said, "I just try to do what's right." Their bond grew stronger with every passing day. It wasn't built on many words, but on kindness, trust, and quiet understanding. Sometimes she would hum old songs in her language while she worked. Ethan didn't understand the words, but the sound was peaceful. It's like wind moving through the grass. One afternoon, dark clouds rolled over the desert. The wind grew sharp, and the air smelled like rain. Ethan stepped outside to bring in the tools. And Nita followed him, holding her blanket around her shoulders. "Storm coming," she said. He nodded. "Yeah, it'll be a rough one." As the first drops fell, they hurried back inside. The storm hit hard. Thunder rolled over the land, and lightning flashed against the hills. The horses neighed in the barn, frightened by the noise. Ethan grabbed his hat and said, "I have to check on them." Nita looked worried. "It's dangerous," she said softly. "I'll be fine," he said with a small smile, and ran out into the rain. Jesse followed right behind him. For nearly half an hour, the brothers fought the wind and rain to calm the horses and keep the barn doors closed. When they finally returned, soaked and tired, Nita was waiting with dry blankets. She handed one to Ethan, her eyes full of concern. "You could have been hurt," she said. Ethan laughed gently. "It'll take more than a little rain to stop me." She frowned, but smiled too. "Still, I worry." Those words stayed in his heart longer than the storm itself, that night. When everyone was safe and the storm began to fade, Nita sat by the fire drying her hair. Ethan sat across from her, quietly watching the flames. After a while, she spoke. "You helped me when no one would. I never forget that." Ethan shook his head. Anyone with a heart would have done the same. She looked down, her voice barely a whisper. "Not everyone has heart like you." Silence filled the room for a moment. The fire popped softly, and the air was warm. Ethan wanted to say something more, but words didn't come. Instead, he simply nodded. The next morning, the sky was bright and clean after the storm. The land smelled fresh, and small puddles reflected the sun. Nita stood outside, watching the birds fly over the valley. "When I am strong, I go back to my people," she said quietly. Ethan felt a heaviness in his chest, but forced a smile, of course. "They'll be happy to see you." She turned to look at him. "You don't want me to go?" He hesitated. "I want you to be safe and happy. That's all that matters." She didn't answer, but her eyes said more than words ever could. A few days later, Jesse came back from town with news. "I talked to a trader," he said. "He knows where Nita's people camp now. It's 2 days' ride north." Nita listened quietly, her face calm but thoughtful. "Thank you," she said. "I must go." That night, no one talked much. Ethan sat outside under the stars, listening to the wind move across the open land. He felt torn between what he wanted and what was right. Ta-ta! Nita came out after a while and stood beside him. "You sad," she said gently. He shook his head, just thinking. She stepped closer. "When I leave, I take your kindness with me. It will not fade." Ethan looked at her, and for the first time, he saw tears shining in her eyes. "You'll always have a home here," he said quietly. The next morning, they packed a horse for her with food and water. Jesse helped tighten the saddle, and Nita thanked him with a smile. When she turned to Ethan, her hands trembled slightly. "Goodbye, Ethan," she said softly. He didn't know what to say, so he took her hand gently. "Goodbye, Nita. Ride safe." She rode away slowly, her figure getting smaller against the bright horizon. Ethan watched until she disappeared into the desert. His heart felt heavy, but deep inside. He knew she would carry a piece of him with her forever. Weeks later, one evening when the sun was low, Ethan was fixing the fence near the barn. He heard a horse approaching. When he looked up, his breath caught Nita was riding toward him, smiling, her dark hair shining in the golden light. She stopped the horse and said softly, "I told my people your heart was kind. They said I should follow mine." Ethan just stood there, speechless. She stepped down, limping slightly, and smiled. "If you still want me here," she whispered, "I stay." He didn't need words. He just reached out his hand, and she took it. The wide desert stretched around them, endless and beautiful, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt complete. Love had found its way where only courage had lived before. It had crossed fear, pain, and silence, and now it lived quietly in that small cabin under the wide Arizona sky.